O dabar išpildom 3 karaliaus norus. Prenumeruojam, sekam ir spaudžiam patinka.
Exposing Victorian influencers who facetuned their photos. Photo manipulation was everywhere. Pirma porą klausimų mano kaip čia vyresnioji publika, o kadangi čia tik tokie renkasi. Kaip jūs, kaip ten palauk sako? Nu, kad tipo tos panos, kur makiažų daug naudoja, ar apskritai, kad makiažas ten vos neblogis, ne tik kad blogis, bet tiesiog, nu, nenuoširdus ir melas. Ar jūs pritarėt, ar tiesiog visiškai negalvojate apie tai, nesureikšminat? Ar visiškai teisybė ir moteris tiesiog melagės yra? Visiškai melagės, catfisherės, visos iki vienos. Kaip jūs... Kokioje stovykloje? Žinau, kad čia mes mylim moterį šitam streame, bet... Galų galia turim pasakyti gana. Užteks. Man ten reiktų makiažų, okei. Kaip ir barzdos ir ačiū savotiškas make-up. Alright. Bet, nu, ta prasme jo, jeigu panos facial hair augintų, tai žinai, aišku, problemų nieks neturėtų su tuo. Bet mes nekam apie facial hair, mes kalbam, kur, net nežinau, čia turbūt galėtų. Iš karto rado, įvedžiau Extreme, iš karto rado. To įjungs. Iš karto rado, kur Extreme, catfishing, make-up, kur, nu, realiai visiškai visą veidą pakeičia. Nu, actually visiškai net pažįstamai visiškai visą veidą pakeičia. Reikėtų susimažinti standartus. Nu, I guess, jeigu jau tai būtų, tai visai kiti standartai in the first place būtų. Bet... yeah, I don't know. Point yra tas, kad... kai kada tikrai atrodo biškai gal ease up on the make-up. Jesus fucking Christ. Kai kada atrodo tikrai, nu, gal ne tai, kad ease up on the make-up, bet atrodo scary, nes tu actually net neįsivaizduoji, kaip žmogus atrodo. Gal, blėt, ir geras patarimas ten eiti, tipo, į pliažą, kur ten, nu, į baseiną ar pliažą, eiti pirmiem pasimatymam. What the fuck. Arba ten, kai patalynė ryte ar kažką reikia valyti, nes tiesiog visa patalynė ištepta, nes makiažas tiesiog atsigulė, žinai, veidą padėjo, skaitosi pana ir... Viską plauti reikia. What the fuck? Nu, tai pačiau, I don't know. Man tik gaila laiko, kad taip veidą kasdien dažyti, pusę veido palieka, žinai, pusę veido palieka. Pažinojau keletą tokių, nu, tai yra ir pažįstu keletą tokių, kur gerai. Gerai, plat, nežinau, papasakot tą istoriją dar. Čia trumpa istorija. Gerai, čia trumpa istorija. Aš nieko blogo nepadariau, bet man kažkodėl gėda šitą istoriją pasakot, I don't know. Čia, I don't know, vat reakcija mano tokia. Buvo viena tokia pana. Ir, nu, mes, žodžiu, taip suėjom ten vieną kartą ir pagyvenom kartu ten kelias dienas, atrodo, ten, žodžiu, anyway, nesvarbu, taip gavos. Bet ten, žinot, buvo visokio, kaip čia sakyti, draugiško bendravimo su ta pana ir prisimenu, ryte atsikėliau ir kai jau nuėjau į vonę, tipo, ant veidrodžio pamačiau, kad aš turiu lūpų makiažą, tokį, nu, ne lūpų makiažą, tiesiog mano lūpos įdomios spalvos. Ir man prireikė kokių 2 minučių, kol mano smegenys ryte atsikėlusios suprato, kad ai, čia nuo jos veido makiažas. Supratau. Ir veido, ir kaklo, ir visur. Tipo, what the fuck? At that point, jau too much tiesiog. Ir čia gauna smarkiai per lėtai, man reikia dar padaryti. Nu tie, žodžiu. Siekia pripažinti, kad skila turi panos, kur taip labai gali pakeisti savo brožus true. Ir kol tai buvo veidas, dar buvo viena, bet dabar taigi ir papus pradėjo dažytis. Ten to šešėlius užsimeta, kad tipo, kai su suknelė kažkur eina, fotkėse atrodo, kad papai didesnių ir geresnių formų, kažkaip jos ten taip pradėjo daryti. Aš nežinau, čia ne taip paplitęs yra, bet aš žinau netgi Lietuvoje kai kurias pažįstamas, kur taip daro. Tai tipo, gerai, jau bišk per toli nuėjo, mes galim pripažinti. Actually biškuką per toli nuėjo. Viskas su saiku ir įskaitant ir saiką, gerai. Boobs, nieks neklaus tavo nuomonės, gerai. Vienintelis dalykas, ką pateisinu, tai blakstienas paryškintos, aišku, neprikliuotos natūralės. Gerai, esmė ta, kad aš pateisinti galiu labai daug ką, nes man patinka vizualiai, kai panos ten pasidažo gražiai. Tipo, viskas vizualiai tas gražu ir patinka, kai labai spalvotai visai pasidažo. Kuo daugiau spalvų, to geriau iš tikro. Kaip klauno make-upą galėtų pasidaryti, man turbūt patiktų, bet reikia pripažinti, kai jau biški fucking per toli nueina. Nu, tipo, ir čia, man atrodo, actually per toli nueina. Hey, what the fuck am I doing here? Čia, kaip man dabar praplės šitą nesąmonę? Ir nesugadinti visko, kad iš šitų imtų. Aš nenoriu tiesiog ją pačią eiti. Gaming is fucking difficult, gerai. Ypač kai esi brain dead. Tada dar labiau difficult patampa. Labas ir vankukiai. Gerai, Godėcija, prisipažink, kad esi ant papų makiažo dėjus. Čia safe space yra, nieks neteis, žinok. Bet actually įdomu, jeigu ne tu, ar draugių turi, kurios yra dėjusios. Nes aš žinau, kad čia yra senas triukas, nu, bet jis tikrai nėra paplitęs, jo nenaudoja, ne? There's no fucking way. Ne. Matot, išsiaiškinau, kad Godėcija didelius papus ir taip turi, jei nereik makiažo, kad juos padidint. Gerai, nes aš turiu porą tokių draugių, kur pažįstu, kur actually daro taip. Tai man vat ir įdomu, nu what the fuck, kiek tas yra paplitę, nu negali būti labai paplitę. Bet bret, jeigu aš pažįstu, I don't know. Zoomeriai. Gerai. Ai, gerai, o dar ta tema tada apie patį facetuninimą tą ir photoshopinimą fotkų ir panašiai. Esu matęs nemažai video apie tą temą. Esu Nerd City matęs, labai gerus video ten, kur, nu, fotkas tas tyrinėja, kur tų influencerių, kur sako, ne, aš natūraliai tikrai, ką jūs nejuokaukit. Ir iškraipytos visos plytelės, ten visi namų freimai, žodžiu, nes akivaizdžiai, tipo, nu, jos ten karpo, žinai, ir daro. Bet tada... nedaro, jo, jis kažkur dingo labai ilgą laiką tiesiog. Labai sad, nes buvo labai high quality fucking ir geri video. Bet I guess that's why we can't have nice things. Bet jo, žodžiu, tai vat įdomu. Ble, anksčiau, kai ryškindavo fotkas, ar jas įmanoma buvo kažkaip pakoreguoti? Ar labiau triukus darė, žinai, ten kojinė įsikišdavo ar dar kažką, žinai, kad, nu, tipo. Tai, nes tikrai nuo tada, kai atsirado fotografijos, nuo tada turbūt iš karto atsirado ir kaip čia padaryti, kad atrodyčiau geriau, žinai, triukai. Privalėjo, kitaip, ble, man sienų per daug, kitaip net neįmanoma, privalėjo iš karto atsirasti, tik klausimas, kodėl aš čia, ble, koper ar padėsiu, klausimas, kokias technologijas naudojo, nu, tipo, ir kaip tą visą įgyvendino. Nes kad atsirado ir kad taip darė, tai nenuginčiamai, ten nėra šansų, kad nebūtų darė. Prieš pusmetį šiaip įkėlė video, kurio aš nematęs, The Worst Video of All Time. Ai, nu jo tam. Gerai, dabar tą visą pasakius, mes galim žiūrėti Exposing Victorian Influencers Who Facetuned Their Photos.
That throughout all of history, the pictorial representation of the human figure has ever promised to be a representation of reality, but that for some reason today, we have changed our expectations to expect.
Pavyzdžiui, jinai ne per daug pasidažius čia, ne? Lūpos. Tikrai, aišku, prieš kamerą dirba, bet ne per daugiausiai netrodo visiškai, lygi oda. I don't know. Kad dažytas tai jo, bet ne per daugiausiai. I don't know. Sunku pasakyti prieš kamerą, nes prieš kamerą tu pasidažysi, ir kaip bebūtų, ir dar tas apšvietimas, bet tipo, matosi spotai ant veido, tame esmė. Matosi dėmelės ant veido, tai kažkiek reiškia gal matos natūralaus veido, I don't know.
This video is
ir kaklas nuo veido nesiskiria spalva, I don't know.
By NordVPN, but more on this anon. So I may or may not have fallen down a slight rabbit hole in which I watched a bunch of those exposing influencers' face-tuned Instagram photo analysis video type things. And ultimately, the general conclusion seems to be drawn that Facetune is problematic and is destroying society. And basically, I just wanted to get on here real quick today to explore this idea real quick.
Victorian makiažas,
guess what? Facetune, photo manipulation in an effort to achieve a general aesthetic ideal is not new to our modern social media era. I feel like it is fairly common knowledge that the Victorians did have some little tricks up their sleeve to alter their photos. We have very obvious, clever, artistic, funny examples of people holding their heads and being ghosts and doing things that we know are not possible, but they were able to achieve these by messing with the negatives. The Victorians had Photoshop. However, I inevitably started looking into this topic a little bit more, and during my research, I found that the practice of retouching photos, just general portraits, pictures that weren't meant to be artistic pieces or weren't meant to be funny or jokes or whatever, was actually really common. So common, in fact, that I actually came across a couple of texts that instruct people not only how to retouch their own photos, but also suggest that photos taken in commercial photo studios, i.e. where you would go to have your portrait taken, retouching was just a natural intrinsic part of the photography process. And the more I looked into this and the more evidence I started examining, the more I realized that these were not just one-off texts of people who said, this is the one true way to do the thing, as we see a lot in the sewing manuals, but the more extant Victorian photographs I looked at, the more I realized retouching is so common. And it ranges from, not only does curiously everyone in every 19th century portrait photo that I have looked at miraculously have perfect skin, but also the figure and the body itself could be very easily manipulated to achieve the ideal body type. And this becomes way more prevalent in the Edwardian period than it does earlier in the
Can trust no one, especially women.
In the Edwardian period, we get a very, very specific and highly unnatural, idealistic body type, especially for women. So the more Edwardian portraits I looked at, and especially the ones that look really sus, like how is your waist that small? How is your bust shaped like that? Like this, something's going on here. Almost every single one of those photos, when I enlarged it, you could see some evidence of retouching. So I know the conversation about how the late Victorians and the Edwardians liked to retouch the waist a little bit to make their waist look impossibly small. That conversation has been floating around, especially the dress history and costuming portions of the internet, for quite some time, and that is certainly something that was very widely done, and we will look at some of those examples. Once you see them, you cannot unsee them, but retouching extends beyond the waist. And just as we today can manipulate our photos in a range ranging from a filter to smooth your skin, all the way up to Facetune to pull in your waist and accentuate other parts of your body, the Victorians and Edwardians had that control over their photos as well, and they did it. And just as we have those ranges today, we see those ranges throughout history as well. We see, especially amongst the Victorian influencers, the actresses, and the Gibson girls especially, who were supposed to have these very, very small waists and this very specific Edwardian figure. There are some of the more dramatic instances of photo manipulation on those images. Granted, these images tend to be better done because there are also very similar manipulations done on studio portraits, people who are very clearly not actresses but just normal humans who have attempted some form of body manipulation in their photographs, and it's very, very obvious. So just as today the amateur budding influencer can open up Facetune and take a selfie of themselves in front of a fence and gently squidge
Oh,
parts of their
wow.
body to be where they want them to be. And
Actually, it
suddenly
takes
the
zero
background-
effort. Actually, tie appai, blėt, nu aš nesinaudoju, žinai, aš nematau, bet actually zero effort. Paspaudai, sumažinai, tipo. Jesus. Ten anksčiau gal labiau pasistengti su photoshopu reikėjo, nu. Ir aš čia nieks nepastebės gyvenime, kad čia užuolaidos pakrypusios ar kažką, žinai. Jesus.
makes those changes very obvious. The Kardashians, amongst modern society, have professional teams of people who can retouch their photos, as well as just more general experience in the art of retouching and knowing what backgrounds to photograph against so that the retouching is a bit less obvious. So it was super interesting to look at all these images and to draw all the comparisons to the conversations that are happening today, centering around Facetune and whether or not it is ethical or artistic or wrong or problematic or misleading or perpetuating unrealistic body ideals. Spoiler alert, I am not wholly convinced that throughout all of history, the pictorial representation of the human figure has ever promised to be a representation of reality, but that for some reason today, we have changed our expectations to expect it to be. So let's do a little bit of investigation. This particular text that I was referencing, this was published in 1898. It does throw some light on some of the typical practices for retouching photographs. It's written directed towards people who wish to get into retouching on a more personal, independent level, but written from the framework of here's how they do it in the commercial shops, and here's how you can try it yourself. This book effectively has chapters on every part of the body, basically walking you through.
Ar jinai ten už nugaros turi ten siūlai? Nevermind, galvoju, kad ten makiažų būtų, kad ten siūlai, nes pamačiau siūlimo mašiną, su kuria beje moku naudotis. Nu, su ta bent jau senovinė, kur reikdavo minti tą, nu, ratą sukti, minti pedalą realiai.
Through what the ideal retouching goals are. There is in the facial section plenty of emphasis on the removal of wrinkles and lines and freckles on the face. No one ever asserted that freckles constituted beauty. In the faces of young ladies and gentlemen, there should be no deep lines or wrinkles. In dealing with the photographs commercially, it is perhaps advisable to err, if at all, in the direction of youth. It is all well and good to read what sounds to be very subjective ideals for a specific practice. However, on examining actual photographs from the late 19th century and turn of the 20th century, I came to realize you really don't see freckles or spots or any sort of skin defect on people, which either suggests that everyone in the Victorian period had perfect complexion, and this is of course also a belief that is perpetuated by the flawless actors that we see in period films. Many of us may have built.
Žinot, kas iš tikro kartais mane užpisa serialuose dabar, kur, nu, blet, ir filmuose, nu, tipo, visi žmonės idealūs yra. Tipo, koks policijos departamentas ten, sekretorė kokia, modelis, na, 10 iš 10, pana, hot as fuck, ideali figūra, idealus veidas. Nu, lesbionės, jeigu, tai kažkaip nuima realistiškumo net iš serialo. Nes iš karto atkreipi dėmesį, nu, aš bent jau atkreipiu dėmesį, kad realybėj, kai būtų, turbūt būtų šiam metų močiutė kažkokia, ten 99% kartų gerai karjerai būtų. Šiam metų močiutė ten dirba prie telefono, sekretorė atsako, užregistruoja, ką reikia ir viskas. Nu, bet, tipo, serialuose tai visi, kokiuose pareigose bebūtų, super fucking hot žmonės, okay, seni.
Built a subconscious bias to believe that natural texture on human skin is a phenomenon of the latter part of the 20th century. Just as today we believe everything we see on the internet, we also don't think to question everything we see in old photography and portraiture. The chapter on the neck especially starts to go into tremendous detail on what bones and shadows and wrinkles and lines need to be removed. He starts talking about this tendon here that needs to be erased from here to here.
Why?
This bit Down here where it connects to the collarbone needs to be left. He talks about any texture on the chest needing to be erased. So they did have the ability to do this. They would do this with paint, they would do this with pencil, they would do this with blades. You could scrape off bits of the photograph, and depending on the quality of the photograph, the colors in the photograph, that would determine what medium you would use. So if you're against a dark background, you could paint in with a dark paint to cut into the waist, for example. If you want to smooth that down, you could go in with white paints. You could go in with pencils if you need a finer line over a dark background. Let's have a look at some images. This woman here, as you can see, her waist has most definitely been reduced. Some of the photographs are more obvious than others. Some of the ones that have been more subtly done require you to open the image, blow it up, and zoom in, and then you can see it. It's kind of remarkable how most of us have just gone all this time without noticing, without looking, because we just look at it and assume it's a real thing, despite the fact that some of these alterations are quite obvious. I think just like today.
Ir 100%, kai kažkas žiūrėjo, žinai, to su draugais ar kažką, ir kalbėjo, kad čia, koks mažas vaizdas, ir sakė, čia tikrai, taip tiesiog buvo, žinai, photoshopo taigi nebuvo tais laikais. Grinai buvo kažkas pasakęs, kad photoshopo taigi nebuvo. Tai negali būti korsetas, gali būti korsetas, bet, matos, I guess iš to, grinai, artefakto, fotkės, kad, čia buvo retačinta. Tai turbūt viską naudojo. Ir korsetus, ir paskui dar retačina. Oh, Jesus.
A warped fence in the background is not something you would think to notice unless you are actively looking for elements of retouching in someone's Instagram photos. This one here is a little bit more subtle. It hasn't been as viciously scraped down at the waist, but you can still see that she's altered a bit of her waist. You can see where the shadow is. This is also where a lot of our myth of these people had 2-inch waists comes from, because we do look at these photographs and we say, oh my God, she's got such a small waist. Whereas if you actually draw in the bit that has been erased out, you can see that they do have remarkably normal waists. This lady here, this is the kind of image that you see on Pinterest, and just right off the bat, it just looks sus. These types of images, if you open them and you zoom them in and they're high enough quality, 9.9 times out of 10 we'll see that they have been retouched. We can draw in her original waist here and find out that she did not in fact look like that, because this is in fact a highly impossible shape for the human figure to have. I mean, just like she's missing like 12 ribs. This is also something that I've been personally very curious about in history, how in photographs you see they've all got these perfectly round, smooth, pigeon-fronted chests, whereas it's kind of impossible to have a chest of that size with no cleavage. Like, how does that work? After having explored the art of retouching, I now understand that they had every means of erasing cleavage lines as well as erasing any bone evidence up here, because you can also create this shape. If you have a very small chest, you wouldn't have the cleavage, but you would have more likely more texture on the chest. So let's talk about the Victorian/Edwardian influencer, because some of the images that we have just looked at are very clearly portrait images of regular women. The last one does seem to be some sort of woman of society. I don't know who she is. I have not
We live in a society
disclaiming that information. The topic of celebrity and what is celebrity is obviously a concept that has changed drastically over the centuries, from politicians, nobility, high society, stage, opera, film, television stars, to now the internet influencer. I'm going to use the word influencer because that is effectively what they were doing. Their clothing, their aesthetics, their styles created this aesthetic ideal that others wanted to emulate because they were perceived to be at this height of a social hierarchy, I guess. One of the quintessential influencers of the time is Camille Clifford. She is a Belgian actress. She is known for her iconic style. She is also one of the best known models for Charles Dana Gibson. So she is the idealistic Gibson girl. The Gibson girl is effectively the equivalent of an Edwardian aesthetic. And I mean aesthetic as in how we refer to the term today, as in cottagecore. The Gibson girl was kind of a physical ideal that people aspired to. And of course, there were Gibson girl influencers who did the look perfectly. The Gibson girl is known for the pigeon chest, tiny waist, that sort of straight-fronted look where it looks like you're leaning forward. That is an affected stance. Your corset is not doing that for you. Camille Clifford's photographs initially threw me for a sort of straight-fronted look where it looks like you're leaning forward.
Tos, tie iš tikro, tie visi išsiraitimai ir nu, tie, blet, neįtikėtini yra. Kai viena draugė treniruodavosi, kaip reikės atsistoti, nu, pasakau tą istoriją, Paika taip darė. Jinai praktikuodavosi, kaip jai reikės fotkintis, nu, kai eidavo į gimon, žinai, visi fotkų vis tiek prašydavo. Jinai mokėjo, jau žinojo, kaip atsisukti į objektyvą, žinai, kaip šikną pariesti, kad, žinai, šikna didelė fotkai matytus. Tai buvo, nuo Victorian laikų realiai moteris kažkokią vienokią ar kitokią pozą, nu, jau darydavo, tipo, fotkėse ir dar to labiau paskui iškreipydavo su photoshopu. Tipo, Jesus.
That is an affected stance. Your corset is not doing that for you. Camille Clifford's photographs initially threw me for a big loop because her photographs are very, very well and professionally handled. I would equate her to like Kardashian level. Her figure, first of all, it looks impossible when you look at her. Oh my God, she had the tiniest waist. How did she do that? She probably in real life did have a relatively small waist. She was probably one of the small selection of the population of high fashion women especially who were willing to tight lace to achieve this fashionable ideal. So I don't doubt that her waist was unusually small. But what she does in the photographs is makes it even smaller. I mean, it's just like a Kardashian today who's had all this plastic surgery done to make their bodies a very specific way, and yet they still Facetune their photos. Because what are you doing if you are not going to the most extreme that you can possibly go to? So initially, a lot of her photos threw me off because they're very hard to spot. She is very strategically almost always photographed against backgrounds that are vague, that are blurred, that are out of...
Nereikia ne tik moteris. Tell me more, palarim tai. Tipo, kad raumenys išiškintų? Neturiu raumenų, tai... Aš šiaip labai nei moku fotkas daryti, nei fotkinas. Tai, I guess, niekad nesuturiu, niekad nebuvo minties, kad reikia photoshopinti fotkę ar kažką. Tiesiog man realiai labai būdavo keista kai kuriais ten kartais, kur nufotkindavo ten ir, nu, matos, kad čia net ne aš esu, tipo. Ten tai automatiniai tie filtrai ir panašiai, man tas, nežinau, su kai kurių draugių fotkais net nesifotkinau, nes nahui ten. Rimtas klausimas, ar tau nusilupus oda nuo ausinių? Ne. Yra biškai... Yra vienoj vietoj. Ne, jos nėra tokios senos dar, bet todėl ir duoda, kai nusiperki ausinės, turi vieną backupą. Bet jo realiai, tos ausinės susivaro su laiku. Galima tų backupų nusipirkti ir pasikeisti, labai nesunkiai pasikeičia, ypač ant cloudų antrų, užmauni naujus ir viskas. Man atrodo, gal aš ir pakeičiau į naujus. Kai būtų vienas, aš turėjau cloudus vienus. Man atrodo, aš nusipirkau antrus po ten 5 metų, nes anie visiškai ten sugedo, man atrodo. Nu tiesiog, kuriuo kampu geriausia fotografijos rodai, kaip stovi ir panašiai. Negu visi aktoriai taip gerai stovi nuotraukos natūraliai. Nu gerai, iš tos pusės jo, aš žinau, iš kurios pusės geriau veidas atrodo. Nu, aš iš vis nemyliu jūsų nieko, na. Tai, jo, bet ne, aš aišku sutinku su to. Gerai, tai čia man reikės auto launch with cargo, tai I guess galiu padaryti taip, auto launchintų, kad man tas raketas. Tik man atrodo, ką man reikės daryti, tai paskui increasinti rocket fuel'o gamybą, nes viskas kitkas kaip ir yra. bet rocket fuelo nėra. Anyway.
Focus so that she can get away with slimming down the waist very easily without that being shown. There is this one in which the retouching is very obvious. You can see at the waist. Her waist is still...
Ne, aš gal prieš kelias dienas nusipirkau ir tiesiog nemegojau tas kelias dienas. Bet aš netaip seniai nusipirkau prieš, man atrodo, praeitą savaitę kažkada ten vidury gal nepamenu. Čia yra šedevras, gerai. Čia yra Picasso šių laikų. Bet jo, kad ir kiek aš čia galiu, aš ne tik, kad aš stumiu, tiesiog aš observinu labiau moteris ir dažymusi ir visokius tokius ypatumus. Man visas tas patinka, man kaip vyrui visas tas patinka. Man sakau, patinka ir moteris ir pasidažo, kai kada biškai patinka, kai per daug pasidažo, tą irgi pasakysiu. Patinka ir kai ten formą savo išryškina, tipo, kam nepatiks, aišku, nepatiktų, nedarytų, tai aš čia kaltas, dėl to esu, dėl tokių, dėl bajobų kaip aš, ir elgiasi taip moteris.
Very small, as we can see, but it's just not this dramatic, literal hourglass shape. We've got this pair of photos. Madam, this is the same photo shoot. This is the same day, you're in the same dress, you're in the same pose. And yet you can see that the shape of her waist is dramatically different from one image to the next. So these are things that you really, really have to be looking for. These are not things that you are going to look at the image and say, oh, that's impossible. In fact, it is so believable that we have created entire mythological beliefs that the Victorians were snapping themselves in half and removing ribs and dying and fainting because of the photographs that we see of people, for example, like Camille Clifford, who doctored their photos to this unrealistic beauty ideal that we believe is true, which honestly says a lot more about our modern understandings of photography and the imagery that we consume and what we choose to believe without questioning today. And this isn't to say that every Victorian photograph that you see ever has had the waist slimmed down. I do think the majority of especially commercial photography that we see from these periods has been retouched, but I think it's primarily on the face and on the skin. I don't think, just as today, people are more comfortable using skin filters to make your skin look nice, but not everyone's comfortable actually physically altering the shape of their body. It's also significantly more effort and significantly more noticeable if you do it poorly to alter the actual shape of the body. It requires a lot more pre-production planning. You have to be in front of the right background that will allow you to do it subtly, otherwise it will be noticeable. That's all to say, this is just the cherry on top. This is just that push over the edge into the exaggeratedly impossible, because historically, and I'm not just talking about the Edwardian and the Victorian period at this point, but throughout pretty much all of historical English dress, especially elsewhere in the world too, historical dress was masterful at illusion, and especially going back to the Edwardian period. By this period, they had such sophisticated methods of illusion to create this completely insane figure that was considered idealistic. So you had to have this very full-fronted chest, which, okay, if you don't have the natural bust to do that, you could pad out your corset. There are so many advertisements for structural devices, bust bodices, bust improvers, things that were very unashamedly sold and worn by women who needed to achieve this aesthetic ideal. You could pad out your hips as well. These two in combination create the illusion that you have a very tiny waist, even though you maybe have not corseted down at all. The waists are not a small waist, even though you maybe have not corseted down at all. The waists are not as small as you think they are. They're not these 18-inch, 20-inch waists for the most part, unless you've got like a high society fashion lady who has been retouched, or like a very young girl. So all of this talk about penciling and painting
young girl, you
and
say.
scraping and retouching and basically going in with artistic implements onto a photograph kind of gets me to thinking about how is this that much different from the portraiture that existed for hundreds of years before the introduction of photography. Before the introduction of photography, people were used to only having reference of people through, well, portraiture or engravings, basically artistic representations of humans, which clearly aren't real. It is so easy. In fact, it is no more effort for an artist to paint someone's waist a little bit smaller, or paint someone's hair a little bit taller, or omit all of the blemishes or the freckles on your skin. It requires no additional step of retouching, it just requires painting it in a very specific way. So part of me got to wondering that in the days before photography, if people just had this intrinsic understanding that the depictions of people that they saw were not actually what these people looked like in real life. And even as the world progressed into the realm of photography, if that mindset stuck around to the point where it felt like a slightly more sharply done portrait, but that intrinsic understanding that this isn't reality still remained for the majority of the beginning of photography's existence. Which got me to thinking, has pictorial representations of humans ever been accurate at any point in history prior to the introduction of photography? Were people more just take it with a grain of salt about the bodies they saw in photos in the 19th century because of this priming of distrust built from their understanding of portraiture and illustrated fashion plates, which everyone knows is idealistic and not real? An additional issue today, though, is that online imagery plays such a huge part in our consumption practices. Kardashians demonstrating their new concealers on heavily filtered videos is literally the definition of false advertising, deceiving people into thinking that the product is doing something that it is physically, realistically not doing. But open any magazine or look at any advertisement from a period prior to photography. Artistic renderings had to be used in advertisements, which were inevitably subject to artistic bias in favor of the product. Even up to the late 19th century, the early 20th century, the 20s, the 30s, the 50s, advertising is still, despite the ability to use photography, very frequently done through idealistic illustration to sell a false reality of the product. Using skin filters in a video promoting your skincare products is therefore honestly nothing new, although it could be argued that the live-action nature of video gives people a subconscious false sense of security in what they're looking at and makes it feel more like actually emulating real life, which causes a problem when you're trying to sell or buy a product. So maybe the issue is that filtering and face tuning is more impactful to us today because we see so much more doctored content.
Wait, what? Ble, čia sugriauta siena, aš ne į tą pusę nuėjau, kurva.
Social media is in our faces 24/7, not just the occasional fashion plate that you see in a newspaper from a high society ball that you will look at, admire, and then get on with your life. Social media shapes our aesthetic interests, our lifestyle aspirations. So many aspects of how we live our lives and what we strive for are literally influenced by the imagery that we see online, which, if we allow ourselves to place our achievements, self-worth, life value in the context of comparing ourselves to what we see online, really does not sound like a good recipe for any remote sense of self-satisfaction. We all have access to the internet. We all can, and most of us do, share things in some capacity online. We know firsthand that the pictures of our lives that we've put online are not the complete version of us, regardless of whether or not we've face-tuned our selfie. So maybe the issue isn't so much that we are creating unrealistic body representation today in the same way that was done in the Victorian period with manipulated photographs, in the same way that was done in the 18th and 17th and 16th century with portraiture, and for centuries before that in the illuminated manuscripts, which most definitely are not anatomically correct. Maybe today we are losing the understanding that what we see isn't reality, this naturally ingrained instinct that people of the past possibly had, that there are truths behind the artistic images that we are presented with, and that this speaks to a broader lack of awareness, lack of questioning the reality and the validity and the truthfulness of what is put in front of us online, of not succumbing to shaping our entire IRL identities based on information that has been curated and fed to us through our internet feeds, that this is actually a much more pervasive and concerning issue across internet culture than someone face-tuning their jawline to be a little bit sharper. Thank you for joining on today's wandering escapades. Staying vigilant and interneting consciously and safely is more important.
Pažiūrim Nerd City